He was in one of the most remote parts of Poweshiek County. And even though there is a cutout that goes back into the corn where she was found, she's over 400 feet, almost 500 feet into that cornfield. She is unfindable other than by the defendant. So, this statement that he gave to Pamela Romero, Officer Romero, he was given multiple opportunities to tell more, particularly during the end of that conversation that they were having near the cornfield in the car whenever Pamela Romero runs him through the events and tries to get more information out of him. How are we here? How did we end up here? Tell us more. Does the defendant ever admit to stabbing her? He says that he blacked out. He didn't black out. He just doesn't tell her. But he told her everything about the confrontation, about how he got to the cornfield, about how she was covered. And he tells her on 2 occasions in the car, I brought you here. More or less, what more do you want me to tell you? I brought you here. And he did. He led them directly to Mollie Tibbetts. These cops had been searching for her for weeks. He goes right there. He tells Pamela Romero, I did it, didn't I? He claims not to remember, claims that he blacked out. He didn't black out. Right? He tells about the confrontation. He tells about Mollie being bloody in the trunk, about hauling her out to the corn, about covering her. He's telling the officer that he did it. He's confessing. He's telling the officers, in telling them those statements, I killed Mollie Tibbetts. That's what he's saying. That's what the statements all point to. We also have, as far as corroboration of this confession, this is a state's exhibit that we used with FBI agent Kevin Horan, who we brought here from Dayton, Ohio. Agent Horan is a cell phone expert, an analyst with the FBI. He's a special agent. He's a law enforcement officer, but has a particular expertise in working on the CAS team with FBI. So we put Agent Kevin Horan on the stand. And what he does, what does this help with? All right? We know that, for instance, Christina Stewart saw Mollie jogging on the road, right? Jogging away from her at right about the same time that the video puts Cristhian Rivera and Mollie in the area. So, but that's a human, right? That's a person that's giving you their views. And, you know, that's what she testified to. There's really no reason to doubt it. But this type of evidence that Agent Horan can offer is electronic evidence, right? Not subject to bias, not subject to impressions. And he helps us establish a timeline with regard to Mollie Tibbetts. He helps us also establish 2 different search areas that also help with the investigation. He knows that Mollie Tibbetts was taken at about 8:30 p.m., shortly before, because she ends up, by his calculation, driving directly south just after that, between 60 and 70 miles an hour. So we know that's when she was taken. That is consistent with and in conformity with the evidence that we see in the video, with Cristhian Rivera's car being in the area with Mollie Tibbetts. It also supports what the defendant is saying at the sheriff's office whenever he's interviewed, that he took her out on 385th. All of the electronic evidence is matching up to help establish this timeline. It's the same location as the defendant states to Romero, out on 385th, right? And also, whenever he takes them to the cornfield that is down on 460th in southeast Poweshiek County, it lines up with that as well. Actually, if you look at his search area, that is the box on the bottom of this exhibit, it puts the area where Mollie was found is on the far eastern edge of that. So it all matches up. It is all consistent. It's the same location that the defendant took the officers to in August, on August 21st of 2018. It matches, and it's electronic evidence. It's not subject to bias. This all fits. This confession of the defendant identifies and proves that the defendant, and only the defendant, murdered Mollie Tibbetts. All right? So component 1 is the video, and all the information we've already talked about. Component 2 is the confession of the defendant, where he says he is solely responsible for Mollie Tibbetts' death. Let's move to some physical evidence here. The DNA that we have in the case. By the way, the DNA defendant doesn't know about, right, at the time that he's first interviewed. This is information that came in later. But DNA proves that Mollie Tibbetts had direct contact while bleeding with the Malibu that is owned and solely operated by the defendant, right? That's what we have. How Mollie was found in the cornfield, the physical evidence that we have there, it lines up with how the defendant said that she would be found, and her clothing in the field. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So let's talk about what we have here with regard to the DNA. All right, these are the two pictures of, there's others of the car that are in, but these two photos that are here that are in the case as exhibits show that the tag that on the Malibu, same tag that Officer Kivy stopped, as well as the blood spot here that you see with on the rubber seal that that the swab was taken from, that was identified solely as Mollie Tibbetts' blood. So we have that, and there's another blood spot that's in the trunk. If you were to stand at the trunk and open the door and look inside, it's here to the left. There's a spot of Mollie's blood that's in there. Mollie's blood should be nowhere near this Malibu, right? Unless it ties right to the defendant, which it does. And it's further identity of his involvement. So the defendant has what? Exclusive control of the Malibu. He never, never, never puts two men in the vehicle with Officer Romero. Has plenty of chances to do that, and he doesn't do it. He also has control of this car from July 18th to August 21st, when it is seized, when it is taken into custody by the Iowa DCI. So he has the ability to clean it, dispose of things. We don't know what the trunk actually looked like on July 18th of 2018. We know what it looked like on August 21st of 2018, and it had two spots of Mollie's blood in there. Did I already say that Mollie's blood shouldn't be in there anywhere? She has no association with this man. It puts her in the trunk. And he knows this now, after it's found. Keep that in mind for later. It's irrefutable that she's there on the seal and in the trunk. How Mollie was found also corroborates the confession of the defendant. There's a series of photos here that we put into evidence. Underneath this corn is the body of Mollie Tibbetts. I'm not going to show you after the corn is removed. It's in evidence. I'm not going to show you that again. You know what it shows. But these pictures that are here, all of which are in, you notice what drew everybody's attention is Mollie's colorful jogging shoes. That's how she was found. But she's underneath the corn. Now look at that corn and those corn stalks. They look like they've been there for a little while. They don't appear to have been moved again by anyone. They're laying across her body as her body decomposes under them. And this is what they found. There's her hand that you can see on the ground. So how does this help corroborate what the defendant told the officer, told Pamela Romero? Well, remember, he took them out there, right? He showed them where she was. He never walked back into the corn with the officers. But what did he tell them that he did? He told them that he put corn stalks over her. Clearly that's what happened. And that's what he told them then. Again, not involving two other guys, right? Only him. It corroborates his confession. He knows that, right? That's what we have here. This corroborates his confession. And again, third component of the state's with regard to physical evidence, location, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, and the condition and of the corn and what was on her body, just as he said. It all corroborates it. It's all starting to fit together. Okay, motive. I want to talk a bit about motive. Motive is not an element in murder. If you look at those four elements that we're just talking about, motive's not mentioned in them. But the judge has given you an instruction that talks about motive and utilizing it to judge whether or not you want to believe something and what somebody's testifying to. So you certainly can look at their motive, their candor, and their bias. So you can look at motive in this case. So if not the defendant, let's look at motive for a bit. Who had a motive to kill her? Who had a motive to kill Mollie Tibbetts? Who? Okay, the defendants spent a fair amount of time on Dalton Jack. We'll talk about him later before we're done today. But if not the defendant, who had the motive to kill Mollie Tibbetts? A sweet girl, a college girl, woman, 20 years old, no other motive. So how does the defendant have a motive? Well, he tells us what it is. Anger's a pretty good one. Anger is probably one of the oldest motives in the history of human beings for why people get hurt. Somebody gets angry and they take steps and act on that anger. Why is he angry? She has rebuked him. Mollie threatened to call the police. We've already talked about this. We'll talk about it again because this does not fit at all with the other two men theory. So Mollie rebukes him. Mollie is threatening to call the police, and the defendant was angry. He says that. He tells us that. He also says when he gets angry, he blacks out. That's what he claims. That's what he told the police. But what do we know? We know that she rebuked him. He did not like it, and he is angry. And the way he reacts to that anger is to stab this young woman to death and dump her body into a cornfield. Now, whenever we look at motive, it's not one of those things where you say, oh, okay, now it makes sense, where you understand really why somebody would do that and have some common understanding with them. That's not what I'm talking about. What motive is having some evidence as to why something happened. And this is why it happened, and we know it happened because the defendant told us that's what was in his head. One of the key things in this case is that the defendant led officers to Mollie's body. No one other than the defendant knew where Mollie was located. The officers, the cops in this case, investigators, agents have been searching up and down, have been talking to all sorts of people, trying to figure out, who, right? Who would have done this to her? Who would have had a motive to do it? But the defendant, whenever they talk to him, they say, take us to her, and he does. Turn by turn. Takes them right there. Right? He led them to Mollie in the dark from Yerby Farms. Remember when they left the police station, left the sheriff's office, they had to go out to Yerby Farms to orient him, and then he took them there. No mention of two other men. Only Mollie's killer would know her location. Only that person. And the defendant's testimony proves how important this is. You know why? He knows this. He knows this is the one kind of thing that people can't get past whenever it comes to his guilt, right? That he led them to the body. Wow, that's pretty powerful. So then what does he do? He comes up with another story. Denial, saw the car, takes them to the body, admits to what we've already talked about, and then number 4, we heard yesterday. Because he's trying to explain this one away. All right, other suspects that's been raised here. Here's some of their names: Dalton Jack, Cheney, Pexa, Tomatich, Ishorn, Culver, all these other names that come up. The cops ran these leads to the ground. They looked, right? They talked to these men. They could find no connection, right? Are they just supposed to ignore everything that Cristhian Rivera's told them at the end and keep hammering on these guys and keep coming back to them? Or do you follow the evidence in the case? Right? They followed the evidence in the case. There's no evidence that any of these men on that list, including Dalton, who we'll talk about a little bit more specifically later, had knowledge of the defendant, knew who he was, had any connection to his Chevy Malibu, or had any real reason to harm this young woman. None. Dalton Jack had no knowledge. One of the things that the defendant says in his testimony, that one of the person, the shorter one, knew the defendant had a child. There's no evidence that Dalton Jack knew that, or that Ron Pexa knew that, right? That he brings up the child because they threatened him. That's the whole reason he says he didn't talk about these 2 guys. I mean, come on. I mean, no knowledge. No connection between any of these men and the defendant. None. So, remember, back in jury selection, we talked about possibilities, right? I think whenever we did jury selection, we did it in 3 different groups. I think I asked each one of you, not each one of you here, but each one of your groups about possibilities. Is it possible? I think the example that I used was, can we go outside of this arena that we're in to pick the jury during COVID? And if there's a $100 bill that's laying out there, is it possible it could be there? Yeah, it's possible. But you don't know, right? I could suggest it. Just because I suggest it doesn't make it true. That's the whole point. Right? All these possibilities that are thrown out about Dalton Jack and Ron Pexa and all these other guys that the officers looked at. Possibility, possibility, possibility. Well, what's the evidence in the case that they're associated? Really none. The evidence in the case that the officers follow, that we're asking you to follow, is what we actually know. And not just because the officers say it, because we can see it. And we can see the maps, and we can see the testimony, and we can, or hear the testimony, and we can hear and see the physical evidence in the case. Just because someone suggests something doesn't make it so. It doesn't mean that you're not firmly convinced about exactly the opposite if the evidence proves that that's true beyond a reasonable doubt. Don't fall for the possibilities. All right. There are 3 other elements. We do have to prove them. I'm going to wrap this up here in just a moment. But the element number 2 is that Mollie Tibbetts died as a result of being stabbed. So now we're got now element 1, identification. Was it Cristhian Bahena Rivera that stabbed Mollie Tibbetts beyond a reasonable doubt? You should be firmly convinced based upon the overwhelming evidence that we have in this case about the defendant. All right? So Mollie Tibbetts then, number 2, died as a result of being stabbed. There's no real issue here. She was stabbed somewhere, I think Dr. Klein said, and Dr. Garvin, who testified, talked about the wounds to the ribs. They did a very detailed examination of her. This woman was brutally stabbed. There should be no doubt about that. We have to prove it. It's the cause of death element. ID is 1, cause of death is 2, right? So the second one that we have to prove, Mollie Tibbetts died as a result of being stabbed. There's no question here. We saw the defects in her jogging bra that are sharp force injuries. I think there were 7 of them. The sharp force injuries that are on her ribs, same thing. So element number 2, that's right, element 1, ID, proven. Element number 2, cause of death, proven. Element number 3, this is one of 2 mental health, or I'm sorry, one of 2 mental states that the defendant has to have in order to commit murder in the first degree. The first one is element number 3, which is the defendant acted with malice aforethought, a fixed purpose or design to do some physical harm here to Mollie Tibbetts, which exists before the act was committed. The same injuries that were inflicted upon her prove malice aforethought. Now that we have identity, we know that it's Cristhian Bahena Rivera that committed these acts, that stabbed Mollie Tibbetts. He would have plunged a knife into her at least 9 times. Sharp force injuries to her neck and to her chest, which killed her. If that's not malice aforethought, I'm not sure what is. And really, the injuries to Mollie Tibbetts and this mental state that was used to cause those injuries that existed before he would have plunged the knife into her really is not in dispute. So malice aforethought has to be proven in order to be murder. So looking at the injuries, looking at the circumstances, the stab wounds, element number 3 is proven. The second, mental state that we have to prove is that the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, with specific intent to kill Mollie Tibbetts. The same evidence that we have here, it's a little bit exceeding that because we can go back to the things that happened on the roadway to help establish what his mental state was at the time, the specific intent to kill. But the stab wounds here, the injuries to Mollie Tibbetts, what he did afterwards, he didn't tell anyone, all of those things, how he left her in the corn, all of those things, the repeated stab wounds that took time and effort to do, there's no other intent here other than specific intent to kill. There is premeditation, there is willfulness, and there is deliberation. He tracked her down, he found her on the road, he got angry, and he stabbed her to death, and he dumped her body. That's what the evidence is in this case. So, going back to our first element, we spent most of the time this morning talking about that. On or about the 18th day of July 2018, it was the defendant who stabbed Mollie Tibbetts. Mollie Tibbetts died as a result of being stabbed. The defendant acted with malice aforethought, and the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with specific intent to kill. This is a saying that I learned from a DCI agent that I worked with. His name was Bill Baszler. He's up in Mason City. He had this on his wall. And Bill's been retired for quite some time. I worked a number of cases with him. And he had this on his wall. It always has struck me as very much driving to somebody's common sense. And that's what we want you to do. We want you to look at this through the lens of your common sense. That's the instructions allow you to do that. And that's what we want you to do, is to look at that through common sense. What is this? When you hear thundering hooves, think horses, not zebras. What does that mean? It means look at the obvious, right? That's what it's after. Don't look for the exotic, right? Look for what the evidence, where it takes you. Look at what the proof is in the case. Look at those things. What the defendant said he did. He never introduces 2 men till yesterday. Think about that. What is the obvious in this case? Cristhian Bahena Rivera is guilty. He is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Looking at all of this evidence in the case, I do get a chance to, by the way, talk to you after Mr. Freeze is done, and we'll have an additional time to do that, and we'll cover some more ground, particularly as it relates to some of the statements the defendant made yesterday. So we'll talk about that. But looking at the evidence in this case, all of it, the video, the confession, the blood that's in the trunk, all the other circumstances, all the other investigation that went into this, it all points to one person and one person only. The judge gave you an instruction right towards the end of the set of instructions that he read. Here's what he said. He told you that your job as jurors, your sole duty as jurors, is to find the truth and to do justice. That's your job as jurors. And looking at all the evidence in this case, looking at everything that we have, all of the circumstances, the truth here is overwhelming that the defendant murdered Mollie Tibbetts on July 18th of 2018, that the defendant committed murder in the first degree. He took Mollie's life. He stabbed her to death, and he dumped her in a cornfield. That's what happened. Justice in this case, ladies and gentlemen, is a verdict of murder in the first degree. Thank you.